Okay. I was planning to go through some very interesting commentaries on this week's parsha, and we have a few figures from the Jewish world. Yeshayahu Leibowitz, who was called by Issac Berlin as the conscience of Israel. He was a public intellectual in the 70s and 80s in Israel, and he published notes on the weekly parsha. So I thought it'd be interesting to share some of these. So from his book, the notes and remarks on the weekly parsha, Devarim. The Shabbos on which the Sidra of Devarim is read is known as Shabbos Chazon, which is the Shabbos before the 9th of Av. It is the perhaps saddest day of the year, commemorating the destruction of the second and first temples. He continues, it is known as this because the Haftarah that is read begins with the word Chazon, the vision of Yeshayahu, one of the most severe and harsh admonitions that was ever directed toward Israel in terms of what its obligations are and of how its failure to fulfill its obligations would bring about the destruction. Unfortunately, there is a lot of tension going on in the Jewish world, as always. And there is not a shortage of finger pointing as to who is in the wrong and who is in the right. The right points to the left. The left doesn't really have a voice. The left is basically non-existent. But I think the Jewish people exist in a collective. So we'll see what he says. At first glance, it would appear that there is no connection between this severe Haftarah and the Sidra itself, which has nothing to do with destruction, but on the contrary, it deals with construction. The summary that Moses gave of the march of Israel through the desert on the way to the promised land, he enumerates all the times that the generation in the desert faltered, but in spite of all these failures, the nation has now arrived at the threshold of Canaan, having crossed the border into it, and has begun occupying it. The people have already conquered the land of Sichon and Og and converted their lands into their own territory. It is now certain that they will inherit all of the land and will acquire it from its earlier inhabitants, and the land will become Israel's inheritance. So it's quite promising. If you want to relate it back, the Lubavitcher Rebbe says that we should live with the times, and he may not have been the original person to say this, but it's the idea of connecting the week's parsha, the week's Torah portion, to what's going on in the world. So to some, it may seem like we are on the verge of reclaiming Israel or reclaiming greater Israel, as many people believe. And let's see what he says. All these things appear to be independent of the nature and behavior and deeds of Israel, which will be granted the land, replace its prior inhabitants. This would seem to be something special in history, and this is said very clearly. I've set the land before you. Go in and occupy the land which God swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give to them and to their descendants after them, and your children, they will enter it, and to them I will give it, and they will inherit it. And I have begun to give Sichon and his land into your hands, begin to possess it. And so the Lord our God also delivered into our hands Og, the king of Bashan, and all his people, and his land, and we annihilated them. And this land we possessed it. The Lord your God has given you this land to possess it. So Professor Leibowitz was quite controversial in Israel because he had put conditions in terms of inheritance. He famously responded to the first Rashi in Genesis, which apparently gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people, but he added that he also gave it to the Crusaders, gave it to the Muslims, and so on and so forth. What he was implying that it didn't stop there, and he further added that there were conditions to possessing this land, and that this land was dependent on the moral rectitude of its inhabitants. But note, among all these verses which imply that Israel is unique in terms of what God chooses for it in history, there are also references to other nations, all the neighbors of Israel and their lands, including some that are historic enemies of Israel. And this is most astounding. So there are references to other nations, all the neighbors of Israel, and the enemies of Israel. So why would it be astounding? It would appear that these references have no direct connection to the conquest of Canaan by Israel. Yet we're told about the Edomites. Do not provoke them, for I will not give you of their land, not as much as a foot's breadth, because I have given Mount Seir to Esau in possession. The same term of possession is thus used in regard to another nation, which is no less than an enemy of Israel. And a few verses later we read, do not harass the Moabites, nor provoke them to battle, for I will not give you of their land as a possession, because I have given Ar to the descendants of Lot as a possession. Okay, well, we still haven't seen explanation as to why this is so extraordinary and surprising. Let's read on. And just as with Israel and with the Canaanites, we are told that the land which is now Moab was once inhabited by the Ammonites, whom the Moabites destroyed, and the text returns to the Edomites. And the Horites also dwelt once in Seir, but the descendants of Esau succeeded them when they had destroyed them and dwelled there instead of them. And here we're told clearly, as Israel did to the land of his possession, which God gave to them. In other words, the history of the descendants of Esau is not different from that of the Israelites. The Israelites are not unique in their history. And again, a few verses later, Moses again refers back to the Ammonites and the Moabites who live in the land once occupied by the Rephites and the Zamzumites. So it seems to be concordant with what the point of Professor Leibowitz I was bringing up earlier, that just because Rashi pointed out that it was the creator of the world who gave Israel the land, the Jewish people, the land of Israel, this is not necessarily the end of the story. Now, I do believe that ultimately Israel is meant to inherit the land, but that is indeed conditional, as it says in many places. And it's conditional on, again, us keeping the commandments, whether you call them moral or not. God destroyed them before them, and they succeeded them and dwelled there instead of them. And he did to the descendants of Esau, which dwelt in Seir, when he destroyed the Horites from before them, and they succeeded them and dwelled there instead of them to this day. The identical language to that used in regard to what God did for Israel, moreover, we're given a note about a nation which it would appear has no connection with the history of Israel. The Abites who dwelt in Hazerim near Azza, and the Caphtorites who came from Caphtor destroyed them and dwelled there instead of them. What is the meaning of these reports on the history of other nations, of those that conquer other lands, and of one nation displacing another? This is to indicate that Israel's uniqueness does not consist of historical events. All of human history, the history of Israel, and history of the other nations, is either a matter of history taking its course, or else one of divine direction. And if Israel is special, it is not because of its having conquered the land or having inherited it, or having taken the place of other nations, but because of the duties imposed upon it in this land, and the obligations which it was given, and which were not given to other nations, for whom too God displays other nations, so that they might inherit their lands. There is therefore profound significance in the fact that this passage is read on Shabbos Chazon before the 9th of Av. So it's beautiful. It's saying that the significance of Jewish inheritance of Israel is not special in the line of its occupiers, except for the special obligations which is incumbent upon Israel to fulfill in the land of Israel. And hence it relates back to the passages of destruction that comes after the Torah reading each week. Um, it perhaps alludes to the idea that the land is conditional and the temple is conditional. And now we will discuss a term which forms a connection between the text of Lamentations, which refers to 9th of Av, And Lamentations was written about 1,000 years after the Torah, and the text of the Sidra itself. In the narrative of Israel's coming to the land or its journey on its way to the land, Moses complains of his failure with Israel on that journey. How in Hebrew, Eicha, can I myself alone bear your trouble and your burden and your strife? And 800 years later, the prophet Isaiah comments on the failure and the conquest of the land of Israel's occupation of it, for it did not fulfill its obligations. How Eicha is the faithful city become a whore. It was endowed with justice, righteousness lodged in it, but now murderous. These words sound as if they are addressed to us today. 150 years after Isaiah came the destruction, and the great lamentation which the tradition, possibly Agadic, attributes to Jeremiah himself. If it was not by him, it was by someone of his generation, we're told. How Eicha does the city sit solitary? So this is with regards to the destruction, the Lamentations that is read on the ninth above, and yeah, the idea of Eicha. There's a sense of bewilderment. How did this happen? On their way to conquer the land, how can I myself alone bear your trouble and your burden and your strife? When they dwelt in the land again, how Eicha is the faithful city become a whore, and in the end again, how Eicha does the city sit solitary? This is historical historiosophy of very profound significance, and the use of the term Eicha, both as Sedra on the coming of the land in the ninth of Av, which commemorates the destruction and the exile, is not coincidental. It is not a matter of the calendar working out that way, but an indication of the significance and the meaning of the course of history of Israel, and to a certain extent to the historical relation and ties between the events in the histories of all nations. Now that's not perfectly clear to me. There's a profound significance. We're using the word Eicha, which is how, both in the Sidra on the coming to the land, which is the parsha, the Torah portion, the main portion of the 5 books of Moses, and the Haftorah, which is read after. It commemorates the destruction and the exile. It's Professor Leibowitz is saying it's not a coincidence. It's not a matter of the calendar working out that way, but an indication of the significance and meaning of the course of history. And to a certain extent, to the historical relation and ties between the events in the histories of all nations. It's so the passages offer profound significance because it's connecting, first of all, between the portion and the after portion, but it's also yeah, it seems to describe a significance in terms of all nations, that all nations have its particular kind of purpose um, that may be in conjunction with the land that it occupies. I think each land has their significance, but most particularly, God frequently engages with humans with questions rather than statements. For example, after Adam ate of the fruit, God asked Adam questions such as where are you? And these questions are for us to think about. How did this happen? How is it that there are these catastrophes? Um, why did it happen? I think throughout Jewish history, Jews have always looked inwards in terms of what the answers are. And I think that's a very anti-narcissistic approach in terms of problem solving, to look inwards. Why is it that this is happening? Rather than looking externally to see, you know, the opponents that are directly before us. And as one person told me, it's in the heart of every person to know the message of God. I mean, each person is different. Um, yeah, each person is different. Okay, so that was the first portion. Now to move on to Rabbi Issac Luria. He's the founder of the Lurianic school of Kabbalah. And perhaps we'll just go through a little bit. There are other commentaries that I am in the process of acquiring. So, Parshas Devarim, the book of Genesis. God promises to Abraham the land of Canaan, which comprises the territory of 10 nations. The Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, and so on and so forth. The first three were synonymous with the Ammonites, Moabites, and Edomites. Again, an allusion to many different nations, many different peoples, which, depending on your interpretation, extends throughout the world. It's not the time to go into it deeply, but certainly they are symbolic. The peoples in the Torah are symbolic of perhaps leaders and other forces that are still present with us today. In the time of Moses, however, whenever God lists the peoples of Canaan, whose land he will give to the Jewish people, only the last 7 of these 10 are mentioned. Thus, as sages note, God only gave the latter 7 nations to the Jews in the time of Moses, and we will inherit the land of the other 3 nations in the future when Mashiach comes. The Jewish people are commanded to entirely wipe out these 7 nations. Of the cities of these people, whom God has given you to inherit, you shall leave no soul alive. Rather, you must wipe them out, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, as God has commanded you. Okay. I think to the lay reader, this might seem problematic because it invokes the idea of genocide. But a quick word on that is that genocide was perhaps commanded in the time of Moses, and there is no commandment today to engage in such a kind of behavior. I think according to the Torah's perspective, there is no right and wrong except for that which God designates. So continuing on, in the portion of the Torah read this week, Moses reviews the journeys on which he led the Jewish people on their way to the threshold of the land of Israel. They were told by God not to wage war against the descendants of Esau, who inhabited Mount Seir, not to wage war against Moab or Ammon. In contrast, they were commanded to fight and conquer the 2 Amorite kings, Sihon and Og. We must understand why, with regard to the 7 Canaanite nations, God commanded us, "You shall leave no soul alive." Whereas with regard to Seir, Moab, and Ammon, he commanded us not to attack them. The explanation is that the 7 nations are earthly manifestations of the 7 evils, the vessels which broke. Thus, all holiness that was originally in them has left them. Right. In some ways, it's said by the Lubavitcher Rebbe that even Seir, Moab, and Ammon represent evils, except that there were something left of them that would be of significance in the future. Yes, this relates back to the 10 organs, the 10 spheres, um, 10 divine organs, which characterize the universe in the Kabbalistic scheme. It wouldn't be the time to go into it now, and perhaps he will go into it anyways. In the world of Tohu, which is the world of, some people translate it as chaos, which collapsed, the full breakage of the vessels occurred only in the 7 lower spheres, from Chesed to Malchus. So the 10 spheres, briefly, it maps on to the human body, roughly speaking. And there are 3 that are intellectual, Chachma, Bina, and Das. And then there are 7 that are emotional, which is Chesed, Gvura, kindness, severity, Tiferes, beauty, balance, Natzachod, victory, submission, Yesod, the foundation, which is the reproductive organ, and Malchus, the mouth. So here we're talking about the 7 from the right hand to the mouth. When the vessels of these spheres broke, they could contain nothing of the holy lights that had been in them. These lights therefore left the vessels, and the broken vessels fell into the lower worlds. becoming the source of all the egocentricity and evil of these worlds. So, in his Kabbalistic framework, the breakage of vessels is symptomatic of evil. The universe began with light and vessel, but the vessel could not contain the light, and the vessel broke, and I think the light and the vessel shattered into lower realms, which is the objective of the Jewish people to elevate from these lower realms. Some of the holiness remained, however, in first three spheres. The earthly manifestations of these spheres were the Kenites, and the Cadmonites. The first three spheres of Tohu, the vessels, were more spiritual than they were in the lower seven spheres. This is because emotions, the lower seven spheres, are much more subjective than intellect or super intellect, the first three spheres. So that, to me, makes a lot of sense. The first three spheres of Tohu, the vessels, were more spiritual. These are the Chachma Bin and Das, and these are the Esav, Ammon, and Ammonites, which the Rebbe correlated them to the impurity of Chachma Bin and Das. This is because emotions, the lower sense spheres, are much more subjective than intellect. Okay. Therefore, even though there was no inter-inclusion amongst the spheres in the world of Tohu, this being the reason why the vessels broke, this was not so crucial in the case of the first three spheres. Their essential natures were not as self-assertive and exclusive of other natures as were those of the seven lower spheres. So here it's saying that the first three faculties of Chachma Bin and Das, which is roughly translated to inspiration, into expansion, understanding, and awareness, these three faculties were not as problematic. Here it's saying that there was no inter-inclusion among the spheres in the world of Tohu. The world of Tohu, as described by Chabad, Chassidics, and Kabbalists in general, was a world of powerful forces. And there was a caveat to this power, that being that it was a lopsided kind of power, to use a Nietzschean kind of framing. They were egocentric. They were not interconnected. And that was the reason why it broke, that there was a lot of egocentricity and individualism, and lack of cohesion. Whereas in the world of Tikkun, the energies may not be so strong, but they are interconnected and much more stable. Their essential natures were not as self-assertive, meaning that the Chachma Bina Das faculties were not as egocentric as the lower faculties. I think we'll just finish with this page and continue, God willing, next time. Since the shattered fragments of the emotions of Tohu are embedded in our world, we can refine them and elevate them. This we do whenever we refine our animal natures, and the completion of this process will usher in the Messianic era. Since, however, the intellect and superintellect of Tohu did not break and did not become embedded in the existential fabric of our order of existence, we cannot refine it. Well, it's saying something interesting, that it is our job to refine these lower animalistic characteristics. The upper three, the intellectual and the superintellectual, did not break. And he's saying that we cannot refine it, but perhaps others say we can. I'm not sure. Here it's saying we can't. In the messianic future, the holiness will completely depart these spirits as well, and thus we will then be commanded to leave no soul alive of them as well. So we are in the process of refining these upper three spheres. We are currently in the exile of Esav, of Edom. And Esav, as mentioned earlier, it represents believe it's Chachma, or some people interpret it as Keter, which is crown, which is even beyond inspiration, beyond the unconscious spark that is already quite abstract, that is even sometimes beyond awareness, and then there's something beyond that. And so in the messianic future, indeed, it's saying that there will be a point when these husks will no longer be relevant either. The elevation or refinement of the intellect and super intellect of Tohu will occur only in the messianic future, when we will be able to eliminate the negative aspects of these spheres as well. These three nations are synonymous with Seir, Ammon, and Moab. Seir alludes to the first sphere, Keter, as it is written, and the he-goat, Seir, is the king. And this is Seir, once again, Edom. Jewish tradition equates that with the Roman Empire, within whose exile we are still struggling and refining. Keter literally means crown, and is thus the sign of kingship. Seir, the southernmost of the three kingdoms, on the far side of the Jordan, thus signifies Keter, or the super intellect of Tohu. Moab means from the father, Me'av, and thus alludes to Chachma. Lot's daughter conceived her son by her own father. So there's a whole story from before that Moab was conceived by one of Abraham's cousins, and the father and two daughters escaped from the city of Sodom after its destruction, and the two daughters, believing that the world has ended, seduced the father by having the father imbibe in wine and conceived by him. And the two offsprings were respectively Moab and Ammon. So Me'av is one of the descendants. When she named him, she expressed this in the name she gave him, since Moab means from the father. The people of Moab descended from this incestuous union. Abba, father, is the parts of Chachma, and thus this nation alludes to the Chachma of Tohu. And Moab was situated immediately north of the kingdom of Seir, and the Jewish people, traveling northward from the Sinai desert, encountered them immediately after their encounter with the Edomites in Seir. The name Ammon permutes to spell Noam, which means pleasantness, alluding to Bina. The insight of Chachma, since it is abstracted from any contextual relationship to the individual's way of thinking, is not accompanied by any sense of conscious pleasure or joy. There is a sublime, only semi-conscious sense of pleasure, but is an abstract and ephemeral as the insight itself. This occurs only when the insight is integrated into the existing mental structure, which is the function of Bina. So once again, Bina is the second of the three intellective spiritual faculties. Bina is often symbolized by the mother. It's symbolized as the egg that receives the seminal seed and expands the the potential within a contextual structure. Um, yes, very much like reproduction, and very much like many things in this world. To be grounded. The new higher perception of reality that is produced engenders a sensation of pleasure and happiness. In a similar fashion, we are taught that the liquid that corresponds to Chachma is water, while that which corresponds to Bina is wine. Ammon was situated immediately north of Moab, and the Jewish people passed by their land immediately after they passed by the kingdom of Moab. So there seems to be a chronology to the refinement of these, or at least the encounter of these different peoples, and they are not coincidental. Moab was situated immediately north of Seir. I believe Seir is the first that they encountered, and indeed that's so. So they encounter them sequentially. The Jewish people encounter these three people sequentially. It seems to symbolize some kind of gradual state of refinement. Now Seir is Edom, and the seven kings who rule there were not from that land, they just ruled over it. This is indicated by the fact that each one is mentioned together with the country he came from, since they themselves were not from Edom. We just identify Seir with Keter of Tohu, which did not break, yet the 7 kings of Edom are always identified with the 7 lower spheres of Tohu, which did break. The Arizal solves this by saying that the 7 kings of Edom ruled in that country, but were not actually from it. Thus, Edom itself does indeed signify Keter of Tohu. The fact that foreign kings occupied the territory of Edom before its kingdom was properly established would indicate the strong connection between the superintellect and the emotions. As we're taught in Chassidus, although the emotions are revealed and guided by the intellect, they possess their own roots and origins within the pre-conscious mind. Let's see if we can end in a more spontaneous and natural manner. Now, when the Torah describes how the Jewish people were not to wage war against Ammon and Moab, it points out that these lands were formerly occupied by Rephaim. Thus, it might be assumed that their territory was indeed part of that of the 7 nations the Jews were meant to conquer in Moses' time, since, as we pointed out above, the Rephaim were one of the 7. The Torah, however, points out that this is not the case, and that God gave these territories to the Rephaim to other parts of Abraham's family, nations descended from the sons of Lot. In the course of discussion, the Torah makes mention of the fact that Rephaim, who formerly occupied the land of Moab, were also Emites, and those who formerly occupied the land of Ammon were also called Zamzumites. The Zamzumites personify the evil portion of Chachma that was removed, as it is written, and as he schemed. The mixed multitude is spiritually derived from them, as well as anyone who has evil thoughts or fancies. I think that's a good place to stop. In conclusion, both Leibowitz and Luria point out that there is a mention of many different nations in this week's portion. And Luria in particular seems to talk about this supersession as having a unique quality. And that quality appears to be a quality of refinement that when a people has exhausted their metaphysical purpose, they go the way of history. Quite a brutal history in the times of the Torah, when the Torah was given, that they were to be wiped out, and that would not be equally tolerable today, because there are international laws by which both Jews and Gentiles are obligated under, and the state of Israel itself is not. It did not start as a religious state, and the intention is not to create a religious state per se. And so it's an ongoing discussion.